been following along in the last couple days or so, we've been going through Chapter 10, talking about the Haight-Ashbury Free Clinic, as it were. If you followed us from the beginning, you know we covered Chapter 7 and 8, talking about cont2, talking about MK Ultra, mind control, and this plays right into that. So today we're going to finish up Chapter 10. That'll probably round out this chapter, and then we'll start again with Chapter 11 as well, kind of more of the same. So, that being said, let's get into it. Talking about CODA, 6 Hours with Roger Smith. Even now, more than a decade later, I get excited when I look at the host of documents I showed Kay that day. Flipping through them, I remember how I felt when I was first reporting on Manson's lost year in San Francisco. I thought I'd found that angle that would set my story apart from the reams of others, the beginnings of a working theory about what really motivated the Tate-LaBianca murders. True, it had come too late to work for Premiere, but it could be the linchpin for my book. I pinned a lot of my hopes on one last interview, a sit-down with Roger Smith. It was set for late December 2001. My deal with Premiere had been off for a year, and I was living off savings, but they were dwindling. If I wanted to earn more money, I'd have to finish my book proposal and sell it to a publisher. When I spoke to Smith, I knew I had to come away with something so solid that I could finish my reporting, and I sincerely believed that I could. To me, it was obvious that Smith had covered something up, and the evidence was so abundant on this point that I'd have no trouble confronting him about it, even if our exchange got contentious. I would show him documents he hadn't seen in more than 3 decades. I would press him on his connections to the HAFMC, to Manson, to David Smith, and more. I would ask him why he'd never sent Manson back to prison, and why he'd gone along with the bizarre plot to send him to Mexico. Needless to say, it didn't work out like that. After the Manson murder, Smith had spent his career behind the well-fortified walls of numerous federal penitentiaries, where he ran specialized units studying or treating sex offenders and drug addicts. It was a path that afforded him plenty of privacy. Over the years, he lived on a yacht off the coast of Hawaii and rural Bend, Oregon, and in a farmhouse more than a century old surrounded by cornfields in Ypsilanti, Michigan, outside Ann Arbor. Smith had agreed to the interview without a moment's hesitation, though I'd called him out of the blue. He was preparing to retire after a decade as director of the Bureau of Mental Forensics for the Michigan State Penitentiary System, and he claimed that none of the many people from his circle I'd interviewed by then had said anything to him about me. On the phone, he told me that he'd been reticent about Manson over the years for fear that the affiliation would tarnish his career. "I'm close to retirement now," he said, "so maybe it's okay to talk." Our interview began in his office at the prison. It ended at his beautifully restored farmhouse, nearly 6 hours, a pizza, and several bottles of wine later. It was late December, and snow was falling. Outside, the fields were blanketed in white, and the houses, his included, twinkled with Christmas lights. Smith lived with his second wife, Carmen, who sat with us in the living room for almost the entirety of the interview. A fire roared in the hearth. Soft rock emanated from a station he'd found on satellite TV. The couple was unfailingly courteous, and I found Smith a patient listener. Only a few times did he betray any frustration with my lines of questioning, even as I forced him to examine papers he hadn't seen in 35 years. But the fact was this: he gave me nothing. On the most important questions about his relationship to Manson, he pleaded ignorance, or claimed he had no memory at all. "I've never been able to understand how he ended up under your supervision in San Francisco if he was paroled in L.A., I said. "I really don't know either," Smith said. He posited that parole protocols were more relaxed back in the 60s, and that officials just didn't care if Manson took himself to another city. Different time, then, I think. Smith had a memory of interviewing Manson as part of his pre-release from prison, a routine process that couldn't have involved him, at least not officially, if Manson was released in Los Angeles. "Well, I guess I didn't," he replied when I told him that. "I don't even remember that he was released out of L.A. But I thought I'd have him dead to rights on the question of Manson's arrest during his parole supervision. I had him look over the letter he'd sent to Washington, D.C., asking for permission for Manson to travel to Mexico. He was actually in jail then, in Ukiah, I told Smith. "Really? I was never notified. This is a mystery to me. I should have been notified." "By Manson or by the people who arrested him?" I asked. by the people who arrested him, Smith said. There would be some federal record of his arrest, convictions, incarcerations, his criminal justice status. Would his parole have been violated for that arrest? Oh, absolutely. I didn't know it at the time, but Smith was right, in a way. There were two federal documents, Manson's FBI rap sheet and his Bureau of Criminal Identification and Investigation record, listing his July 31st, 1967 conviction, proving that the government had been notified. The first of those documents dated to the time of Smith's supervision, so he would have been notified too. The probation office received such papers as a matter of course, but he was saying he wasn't. For good measure, I checked with another federal parole officer who'd worked in the Bay Area in that era. He confirmed that the Justice Department would have automatically notified Smith of Manson's conviction. Even back then, he said, the federal guys didn't mess up. Whenever I reread my interview transcripts, I wince at moments like these. I prepared diligently for these conversations, especially in cases where I thought the right questions could bring major new revelations. Reliving marathon interviews like these, I sometimes kick myself even for having had to stop the conversation to go to the bathroom. Maybe if I hadn't taken a break, things would have gone differently. Even now, I wonder what could have happened if I'd held off on confronting Smith until I had marshaled every possible resource. In 2001, for example, I hadn't yet found the glowing recommendations he'd provided for Susan Atkins, effectively winning her probation a year before the murders. If I'd had that, I could have challenged a bunch of the assertions he made about Atkins that night. He called her a hard lady. And he hoped that she never got out of prison. She was scary. She was aggressive. I thought she was sort of Charlie's operative. Quite an about-face from the man who'd claimed in 1968 that Atkins would comply willingly with any probationary conditions aimed at her rehabilitation. I pointed out that Manson had apparently continued to invoke Smith's name after their parole relationship dissolved. Manson and the girls continued visiting him at his office at the HAFMC, and even at his home. I told Smith I think he was still trying to pass you off as his P.O., but all he had to say on the subject was, "Oh, really?" When Smith said he'd never been asked to testify at the trial, despite having served as an expert witness in lots and lots of trials, I told him and his wife how much that baffled me. They seemed perplexed, too. I asked, was there something going on behind the scenes that your testifying would have exposed? A big picture that they didn't want exposed? Maybe like in L.A., where they kept releasing him for offenses without charging him when they had evidence against him? For the first time, Smith lost his temper. Okay, you're operating from the theory that he was tied in. Something else was going on. Tom, I can't help you. I don't know. His face reddened and he shouted, I really don't know. Because you were part of his gestating phase. In San Francisco, I thought maybe you might have an indication. Yeah, I saw his talent. I saw his bullshit. He was very glib, Smith said. I had known for a long time how powerful his effect was on people. His particular brand of psychobabble was as persuasive as anybody on the street. He reminded me that San Francisco in the late 60s may as well have been another country. So different were its customs and mores. I was sympathetic to a point. But then I'd spoken to so many people about this period that it felt at once totally near and completely alien. So many of my sources, even the most reliable, had trouble explaining their feelings and motivations. Not just because so much time had passed, but because some schism stood between them and the past. It was irreparable. Wherever the 60s had come from, they were gone, even in memory. As we refilled our wine glasses, Smith conjured the scene. It was a time when birth control pills first became widely available. You'll find this absolutely stupid. Women used to walk around and pull up their sweaters to show that they didn't have bras, and they would actually seek you out to have sex. Unheard of, he continued. Then comes the whole drug thing. Then comes the Haight-Ashbury. The whole Bay Area is one of the most electric places you could possibly be. It was like a magnet. Manson, he said, had arrived at the tail end of his innocence. When Smith traded his parole job for the ARP, he remembered the height already yielding to speed, the beginning of one of the most incredibly destructive patterns of drug use I'd ever seen. The first 6 months I was there were 30 murders within, like, a 6-block radius of the office we had. It was middle class, totally naive kids. It was immersed maudlin, stupid theater that you've ever seen. In a scene like that, the Charlie Mansons of the world were a dime a dozen. The Haight was so flooded with weirdos, seekers, addicts, and guru figures that no one batted an eye at him. If anything, Smith said, Manson was a little more respectable than many of them, insofar as he eschewed speed and asked his followers to do the same. He was very odd. He was a hippie, it was clear. He was very manipulative. But was he highly dangerous? Didn't see it. I didn't let him travel. And there were some checks and balances. Basically, he was in the Bay Area. He was in my office every week. I saw him a lot. Not only in the office, he came in with his girls. After a while, and I think that became kind of an annoyance to the office. I made a mental note of that comment. It seemed to confirm that Manson was visiting Smith for official parole meetings at the HAFMC. Later, he backed away from it. My association with the clinic really was pretty intermittent, he said. It wasn't until after I left federal probation that I came down there. The chronology confuses me, I said. The people at the clinic all thought he was coming in for probation? No, I had left the probation. So he was just coming in to say hello? First of all, he didn't come in that often, Smith said. I never saw him in any official way, and I also never invited him. There could be nothing untoward about Manson's appearances at the HAFMC, he implied, because a conspiracy takes careful planning, and no one there had the capacity to plan anything. Nothing happened according to schedule in the Haight-Ashbury. You had people walking around jacked up on 2 grams of speed, tempered out with heroin, and people carrying guns and tweaking on acid, and it was absolutely crazy. Actually, Charlie and his girls were the sanest people around in some ways. That claim shouldn't have surprised me. Manson had endeared himself to Smith, so they were close enough that Smith felt comfortable taking care of Manson's baby. He looked after the child for a couple of months, I think. I know it was long enough to have the baby circumcised, which I think really pissed him off. When we'd finished our pizza and made our way through most of the final bottle of wine, I steered Smith back toward the subject of Manson's psychology. I still felt that he was trying to have it both ways, to acknowledge Manson's anger and instability, and, sometimes in the same breath, to downplay the eccentricities of a man who'd started a cult as Smith watched on. There was this unquestioned loyalty to Charlie while they were in San Francisco, but there was almost a good-natured quality to it, Smith told me. There was still the ability to joke with him and push him. In his mind, the move to the Spawn Ranch was fatal, and that it took the family out of society. They were isolated, they were doing acid every day, and they were essentially without any reality checks at all. There's a time when everything flips, and I don't know when that was, but it sure as hell wasn't when he was in San Francisco. Explaining why he refused to talk about Manson for more than 25 years, he said, there were a lot of people who became overnight experts on Manson, particularly back then. Even now, I'm prepared to tell you to get the fuck out of here at some point. You understand what I'm doing here and what's important, which is me. The thing is, Tom, as I look back on that time, I don't know what else I could have done. I felt real sadness about it. I don't feel any culpability. That about summed it up. Soon I thanked Smith and his wife for their generosity and got to my feet. We'd all had some wine, and there was a warmth, if not a trust, in their rustic old farmhouse. I remembered suddenly that it was almost Christmas. They led me to the back door, both of them waving as they saw me out, flakes of snow still falling from the night sky. In my rental car, I took the old highway back past the prison that Smith worked at. Apparently he'd personally planned their new $10 million mental health care facility. The thought of it made me feel small. He'd been more than accommodating, hadn't he? And he'd taken a serious look at the papers I'd found, had given serious consideration to my questions. On the face of it, I had no reason to be dissatisfied, having just gotten hours of tape from one of the most reclusive officials connected to Charles Manson. And yet, as I dwelled on it, the interview felt strange and inconclusive. The closer I got to my motel, the sadder I got. I wasn't finished with the story, or even close to finished. I'd gone to Michigan expecting to shock Roger Smith with uncontrovertible evidence of everything he'd overlooked. He had reacted, basically, with 6 hours of shrugging and some free wine and pizza. Soon enough, I transcribed the interview and started to work away at the little inconsistencies and contradictions in Smith's account. But at the moment, I was crestfallen. Even supposing I could find something to push back on, was I right about any of it? Or had Smith entertained 6 hours of questioning from someone peddling conspiracy theories? His denials felt wrong to me, but I'd had hours to prove my case to him, to get him to break, and I hadn't. I headed back home to Philadelphia for the holidays. No one knows me better than my family, and over the Christmas break they noticed right away that something was off. I was aloof, skipping meals to work on the book proposal and figure out my next moves. Stuck in my own head, going through the paces of my story, I tried to construct a coherent narrative out of interview transcripts and dozens of discarded drafts of my dead premiere piece. With no new revelations from Roger Smith, the ending was a big blank. I'd also told my father, sheepishly, that I was running out of money. He generously offered me a loan, as much as I needed to keep me afloat, and I accepted. I meant it when I promised I'd pay him back. My father was a tax attorney and law professor, and I realized that I'd never given him a full debriefing on my reporting, even as it became increasingly legalistic. That Christmas, I filled him in on everything I'd learned, walking him through my collection of 3-ring binders, their pages now dog-eared and marked with a rainbow of neon highlights and plastic reference tabs. To my relief, I watched as my sober-minded father transitioned to my thinking. He told me that he had never trusted Bugliosi, too arrogant, too flamboyant, and now he was ready to roll up his sleeves, take out his red pen, and help me in the best way he knew how, by arguing with the U.S. government for records. With his legal knowledge, he helped me fill out new FOIA requests and file appeals to old ones. In the coming months, and for several years, he accomplished what I had been unable to, forcing unwilling bureaucrats to fill in redacted documents and release information in dribs and drabs. It wasn't enough, of course, to fill in all the gaps, but it got me closer to the truth. And it would never have been possible if I hadn't won over my old, buttoned-up dad. He believed in what I'd found. He had the same questions that I did, especially about the parole board's reluctance to release Manson's file. Why were they hiding all this? Everything about the case should be publicly available, he thought. His skepticism kept me going. After the new year, he drove me back to the airport so I could fly back to L.A. I'll never forget the father-son pep talk he gave me. It doesn't matter to us, he said, if you're never able to prove all this. The fact that you tried so hard is all that matters to us. I headed back to the West Coast, feeling reinvigorated, aware of how lucky I was to have my family behind me. At least, I thought I could have my book out in time for the 40th anniversary of the murders in 2009. And that will wrap up Chapter 10. So we will get into Chapter 11 next on mind control, as promised. There are multiple sections to this chapter as well, and I think you'll find that rather revealing and how that correlates to the things we're seeing play out here today as well. So, that being said, that concludes at least Chapter 10, the 3 parts that took us to get through that. Appreciate you guys' comments, following along. Again, if you're new to this and want to go back, there are a couple chapters net here on the channel you may be interested in. Chapter 7, Chapters 8 we've been through, Soko and myself. If you want, take a listen back on those, get caught up, and then we will get into Chapter 11 on the next one. There we go. So that being said, this is Spectre signing off. Appreciate you guys tuning in, and we'll see you back on the next one. Take care, everybody.